fragmentation. We're drawing specifically from the complex, really fractured narrative architecture of day-me and night-me found in the source material. And we're diving deep into the schism of the self, asking a core question that, well, experts often wrestle with. Does this fragmentation primarily represent a tragic, singular psychological pathology? A catastrophic internal collapse, leading to what the text calls the sterile residue of pathology.
Or is it perhaps a structurally necessary, maybe even self-engineered defense mechanism? A shield against an overwhelming, chaotic, and externally imposed reality?
Exactly. I maintain that this architecture is fundamentally a functional, structural response to systemic pressure and profound shame.
Whereas I'll be arguing, quite forcefully I think, that it must be defined as a debilitating pathology, something resulting from fundamental internal failure and, crucially, physical confinement.
Okay, well, I see why you'd categorize this as purely clinical, but let me offer a different perspective, one rooted in, well, defense. The construction of day-me and night-me, it isn't merely a symptom you tick off on a checklist. It's a desperate, maybe even masterful act of psychological engineering. It's a form of psychological transference, creating what amounts to a perfect self-serving story.
Masterful engineering?
Well, think about it this way. To understand the motivation behind this invention, consider that scream hypothetical from the source material. If Sidney Prescott had actually invented Billy and Stu, she would have effectively outsourced her own violence and guilt, right? Allowing her to maintain this pristine, victimized identity.
Okay.
Similarly, the observer's mind actively uses the physical environment, the bulletin board, the static, whatever, as a screen. A screen upon which to, quote, project his unbearable internal state. Day-me and night-me are these invented personas. They are functionally fixed false beliefs, delusions, used explicitly to assign agency, moral responsibility, and even purpose to his torment. This grand, elaborate fiction, the cosmic struggle, the temporal paradox, this existential dread, it's constructed precisely so the observer can maintain the heroic victim role and, crucially, avoid the far more terrifying reality of his own meaninglessness. He essentially chooses a meaningful, self-engineered hell over the deep shame of just being ill.
That is a compelling analysis of motive, I grant you. But I would argue that motive becomes ultimately irrelevant when you're faced with the devastating reality of the material's architecture. While the ego certainly seeks comfort in a grand narrative, sure, the devastating punchline, the reveal about the bulletin board fundamentally determines the nature of the suffering.
How so?
Well, we learn, don't we, that the observer's supposed flickering screens were unmasked, not as conduits for some temporal warfare, but as just ordinary bulletin boards in an asylum. Notices like medication time, visitor hours, group therapy room B.
Right, the mundane details.
Exactly. This reveals that the arguing specters of day-me and night-me are nothing more than projections of the observer's shattered psyche onto, well, inanimate objects, thumbtacks, peeling paint. The profound cosmic struggle, it just violently evaporates. What's left is the inescapable confinement and the sterile residue of pathology. It reduces truly profound suffering, internal suffering, to the suffocating banality of the padded cell. The architecture isn't defensive, it's fundamentally confining. And we really must start by grounding this discussion in the clinical definitions, because they reveal the profound fragility of the observer's perceived reality. Day-me and night-me are sustained by the primary symptoms of psychosis. We clearly see the cognitive symptom of delusion, that fixed false belief, totally impervious to evidence, and the sensory symptom of hallucination, a false perception imposed on what's described as mere static or noise.
But couldn't that perception still serve a function?
Well, the narrative itself provides strong evidence against this being some functional, stable architecture. The personas themselves, they're unstable. Their roles actually bleed, as the text says. The initial liar, day-me, eventually starts uttering truths, while the supposed truth-teller, night-me, begins weaving demonstrable falsehoods. This immediate interchangeability and instability, it confirms that the entire conflict is an internal psychological collapse. It results from the fundamental subjectivity and instability of truth within the observer's own delusional perception. It proves it's an internal breakdown, not some measured response to external reality.
I'm still not quite convinced by that line of reasoning, because it feels like it focuses solely on the clinical labels, the what, while maybe ignoring the structural imperative, the why, that drives the collapse in the first place. You describe the outcome, psychosis, yes, but I am really interested in the why. The self-imprisonment is, paradoxically, highly functional in a very specific, perhaps tragic way.
Functional how?
The entire intricate fiction, this horrifying architecture of day me and night me, it seems engineered precisely to ensure the suffering feels profound, complex, and maybe even unique. This grand narrative defense is deployed against the ultimate terror for any thinking mind, reducing his profound, deeply felt suffering to the, quote, meaningless dimensions of his diagnosis. By constructing this elaborate schism, the observer actively builds his own prison, yes, defined by fixed false beliefs, but maybe simply to ensure that his torment is meaningful, while a sterile product of chemical imbalance or something mundane. The agency here, perhaps, is found in the performance of the suffering itself. And this struggle for meaning, I don't think it's isolated. It seems amplified by a surrounding systemic phenomenon, what the source calls structural neurosis. We are arguably living in an environment of continuous modulation, where these vast systems, often powered by AI now, act as a kind of false prophet. They generate intensely emotionally charged but incredibly short-lived narratives, hyperstition as it's termed.
The 10-day cycle.
Exactly. This chaos burns out, usually in, 10 to 11 days? Demanding continuous cognitive engagement, continuous reaction. Now consider the individual with the high-variety brain, often associated with conditions like ADHD. This is a mind that seems to require high-intensity stimuli for engagement and struggles acutely with low-intensity mundane tasks. This chaotic external environment, it's uniquely detrimental. So when this individual experiences intense shame, what clinicians call rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or RSD, that fear of failure or criticism drives them to seek justification for their internal pain. They might seize upon these chaotic, hyperstitional narratives, interpreting them as a profound, self-defining delusion of grandeur that somehow rationalizes their internal friction. This reality fractaling, this fragmentation mirroring the external chaos, is what risks becoming a widespread necrotic contagion, potentially leading to the kind of nihilistic output from the youth the material hints at. The individual psychosis, in this view, is merely the sharpest edge of a larger societal structural failure.
That's a truly compelling argument about the structural pressures, especially concerning hyperstition. I won't deny the impact of the external environment, but I think you might be overlooking the internal cost, which I believe overrides the external chaos. I'm not suggesting society is, calm and orderly, but rather that the observer's internal mechanisms are perhaps already fatally compromised before engaging with that chaos.
How so? Compromised?
The high-variety brain, needing that constant, almost ephemeral, bottled lightning of stimulus you described, struggles profoundly with what psychologists term temporal discounting. Basically, this means the brain sacrifices long-term stability, future rewards, consistent habits for immediate, intense gain. Now, in this desperate search for regulation, the reliance on a chemical crutch, whether it's prescribed or self-medicated, often actively disables the crucial neural circuitry responsible for long-term self-regulated habits, specifically the basal ganglia. We don't need to get bogged down in the neuroanatomy, but the effect is crucial here. This neurobiological price essentially ensures the individual becomes locked into increased reliance and worsening executive dysfunction over time. This guarantees long-term instability regardless of whether the external narrative is orderly or as chaotic as you describe. So the primary trap, I'd argue, is profound neurobiological self-sabotage, an internal fragility that makes the observer or anyone like him acutely susceptible to any external chaos rather than the chaos being the sole cause.
I certainly acknowledge the neurobiological fragility and the devastating trap of temporal discounting. That's a powerful point. But the observer's choice, or perhaps compulsion, to create day me and night me still feels like an act of will, or at least an act of psychological construction projected onto that fragility. Incorporating the scream analogy, as the newer material does, fundamentally alters how we have to view the original narrative's bulletin board material, doesn't it?
How exactly?
Well, day me and night me aren't just passive misinterpretations of mundane notices anymore. Their conflict, their dialogue, the sheer complexity of it must be understood as a sustained, incredibly detailed auditory hallucination. This is the observer's own complex, probably conflicted internal monologue, externalized into a dialogue between two invented personas. This forces us, I think, to reevaluate the observer's agency, not as a passive victim of circumstance, but as an active constructor of his narrative psychosis. He's using the power of transference and, frankly, robust hallucination to sustain his detailed delusion on the absolute barest of external stimuli, just static, some tax, maybe the sound of peeling paint. He is performing his meaning onto the void.
Okay, well, that perspective definitely emphasizes the active role of the observer's mind, the sheer effort involved in the hallucination. It seems to me to overlook the sheer narrative weight of the depth. The new sources enhance our understanding of how the projection works, how the mind imposes, as you say, a narrative of its own damnation onto mere static or noise, but they don't negate the conclusion, do they? The fact remains that the prophecies he hears, however complex and detailed the dialogue might be, are ultimately derived from mundane institutional notices like medication time. This reveal ensures the thematic shift is absolute. The narrative pivots, it has to, from this grand exploration of cosmic dread and temporal paradox to focusing squarely on the fragility of perceived reality and the inescapable, sterile residue of pathology. The entire horrifying architecture of day me and night me collapses into the simple, brutal fact that his supposed temporal house was nothing more than set dressing for his delusion. It fundamentally strips the conflict of its initial, perceived significance and reduces his existence, ultimately, to one of clinical confinement.
I see why you prioritize the clinical finality, the punchline of the reveal. But I still maintain that the day-me-night-me schism must first be viewed as a functional, if ultimately, yes, self-destructive defense. It represents a sovereign ego's frantic struggle to maintain distinction, to maintain moral agency, in a world of accelerating modulation and, frankly, statistical redundancy. The high-variety brain, already prone to chaos and shame via RSD, is perhaps structurally forced to engineer this elaborate, meaningful internal narrative simply to avoid collapsing into utter nihilism. The very complexity of the observer's self-deception, for me, demonstrates how structural, systemic pressure can create the very conditions for individual psychosis, perhaps even as a perverse kind of defense mechanism.
That's a powerful stake upon the systemic pressures. And I don't entirely disagree with the influence of the external. However, I have to return to the facts of the confinement itself. The architecture of day me and night me, regardless of external societal pressures, regardless of the depth of the observer's agency in crafting it, is definitively recontextualized by the narrative's end, as a delusion of imprisonment. The observer is revealed to be a patient lost in delusion. His profound suffering, his insights, they're tragically reduced to symptoms. He is, quote, forever mistaking the bulletin board for the universe and its own ramblings for the whispers of eternity. And that highlights the stark, suffocating reality of an internal mental collapse from which, it seems, he cannot escape, no matter how clever or complex the hallucination becomes.
So we've traced this terrifying boundary, haven't we, between internal psychological failure, the neurobiological self-sabotage, the temporal discounting you pointed out, and external systemic pressure, driven by things like hyperstition.
The material strongly suggests that whether the primary cause originates from a chemically compromised internal structure or from an externally engineered chaos-inducing environment, the result looks terrifyingly similar: the dissolution of the self into internal chaos and fragmentation.
Which leaves us with the profound question: does escaping this kind of neurosis require rigorous individual self-mastery, a way to somehow overcome these internal deficiencies?
Or does it demand a wholesale dismantling of the external systems, the systems that seem to profit from our cognitive vulnerability, our shame, and our desperate need for meaning in the noise? That remains, I think, deeply unresolved.